When reading the biographies of historical figures, their stories are often centered around the biggest events. We hear about the battles, meetings of minds, and great disasters. Not so much what happened in between. That is because the day-to-day life of most people has always been quite boring. It was seldom recorded because it wasn't deemed interesting or out of the ordinary. But in the case of sailors and pirates in the 18th century, it's quite hard for us to imagine what life was like aboard one of their ships. It's just so different from our modern experience. We always hear about the ships they plundered, the men and women they mistreated, and their ultimate, often grisly fates. But what did they do in between? Just how was life aboard a pirate ship? In movies and video games, we often experience pirate ships as being quite spacious. This wasn't the case. As indicated by the opening quote, even the largest of pirate ships were cramped. Personal privacy was virtually non-existent. Then again, the concept of privacy wasn't much of a thing in the pre-industrial period. Most people grew up in large households, sharing rooms and beds with their siblings. Adult life wasn't much different. Pirate ships were especially small. Most of them were one-masted sloops. Even the larger ones seldom weighed more than 400 tons, about the size of the smallest ships in the Royal Navy. The purpose of a pirate ship was to chase down a target and escape pursuers, after all. They had to be fast. Adding to that fact was that pirate ships were crowded. They crammed as many men as they could aboard their vessels, in order to overpower their target by sheer force of numbers. A typical merchant ship usually had a crew of around 30 men. A pirate ship of comparable size had 100, usually more. Merchant ships had such small crews because you didn't really need that many men to effectively sail a ship. Of course, crewmen were rotated between 4-hour shifts, alternating between working and recuperating. Work included such duties as manipulating the sails and rigging to optimize speed according to the wind, and other routines like weighing or letting go an anchor, striking topmasts, tallowing masts and strakes, pulling or picking oakum from between the woodwork. Planks in dry weather need to be wetted in order to keep the caulking tight. Provisions were shifted around in the hold for the sake of balance. Pirate ships were said to be dirtier. Aboard a navy ship, the crew wholly stoned the deck every morning. That is, scrubbing it clean with sand and Bible-sized stones. Pirates, generally being lazy gits, often avoided this task, leaving them with even more time to kill. Craftier pirates may have spent their downtime productively. They might mend their clothes using such improvised materials as shark bones and hardened cheese rinds to carve buttons. Bones and wood could likewise be carved into little items in what is called scrimshawing. Whilst merchants and navymen kept their small arms locked up in the armory, every pirate owned his own weapons privately. He might sit and sharpen his sword or clean his musket and pistol. Pirate weaponry were always loaded and ready for battle. It was discovered in the wreck of the Widow Galley that her cannons were always kept loaded. On a regular ship, the guns were only loaded before an engagement. Aside from individual maintenance, pirates might engage in exercise. A prisoner aboard the ship of Richard Taylor remarked that the crew often engaged in target practice or duels with wooden sabers and rapiers. They may have engaged in greater courses. Privateer Captain Woodes Rogers arranged a mock sea battle, where his crew trained at loading and firing their cannons. Some men were even stained with buckets of red paint and taken down to the lazaretto, so that the surgeons too could have their training. But sailors usually became pirates for a reason: to enjoy themselves. Most of their downtime was spent in leisure. For one, musicians were always playing to entertain the company. Their instruments included fiddles, pipes, trumpets, and drums. While some pirate ships were cleaner and some more organized, music seems always to have been the norm, unless the captain was a strict Puritan. These would also regulate gambling, even going so far as to throwing the dice overboard. Other captains even forbade gambling, as to prevent fights from breaking out. Dice and cards were the most popular modes of gaming. There were some more innocent pastimes. A general history famously described how pirates arranged a mock trial, a sort of theatre, where one man played the judge and the other a victim. One pirate had been a play actor during his youth in England. After a brief flirtation with highway robbery, he ended up in chains and deported to Jamaica. The pirates freed him, and he repaid his comrades by writing and producing a shipboard play for them to enjoy. It was called The Royal Pirate, and featured Alexander the Great sentencing a pirate to death. Death and legality seems to have been a common theme in pirate entertainment, and was likely part of their morbid humor. When ships crossed the equator, experienced sailors often dressed up as Neptune and dunked the new bloods into the sea. But there were also some more normal activities. The most expected was just discussion. Pirates could talk about everything you'd imagine, and some of their topics were recorded. Ned Lowe is a pirate mostly remembered for cruelty. His crew were recorded as discussing the separation between church and state. On Valentine's Day, the buccaneer crew of the aptly named Bachelor's Delight were caught discussing the intrigues of women. Some superstitious crewmen believed this to be the reason for the bad weather that followed. An educated buccaneer named Richard Gobson was known to carry with him a Greek Testament, and often read aloud to anyone who listened. Reading in pre-industrial times was often a public activity, with the whole family seated around and doing chores whilst one of them read aloud. This was possibly a common occurrence on ships, where the literacy of the average crewman may have been limited to simply sign your name with an X. Many of the buccaneers kept their own well-written and often poetic journals, which were subsequently published and sold at a profit. Other journals may have been lost to time and the sea. Many a pirate just wanted his privacy to read or study. An Irish privateersman, William Batey, wrote how he often used to sit across the spritsail yardarm in fine weather, with a book or a fish gig to strike the fish. A pirate officer was documented as breaking into a cabin and throwing all the books overboard. According to him, there was enough jaw work in those books to convince some of his crewmen to abandon their way of life. In other words, this was a move of censorship. A better activity for such rogues was drinking. Aboard a pirate ship, alcohol was unrationed and freely available. Their favorite beverage was rum punch, a mixture of rum, sugar, and lime juice. If rum wasn't available, as was often the case, they drank brandy or wine. In the Indian Ocean, arak was the name of the game. Just as popular as rum punch was hot chocolate, a favorite treat for breakfast. Their food was usually quite good. Pirate voyages were centered around tropical islands abound with provisions, and the voyages themselves didn't last longer than they needed to. But I made an entire video series about pirate food. In total it's about an hour long, so you should go and watch that when you're finished with this one. And since you watched this far, you might as well hit that like button and tell me in the comments what you would have done to kill time. I remember that scene from Dead Man's Chest where Jack walks through the deck full of crewmen in their hammocks. On the big screen we usually find sailors sleeping below deck, either in the forecastle or on the gun deck between the cannons. Due to the lack of space, crewmen were expected to share their hammock with a comrade. This didn't mean they slept together. Usually they were paired so that both were never off duty at the same time. The conditions below deck were unpleasant. Air conditioning was non-existent and there was virtually no ventilation. That meant the below decks were very warm in the tropics and smelled horrible. The natural odors of a ship, pine tar, wet wood, linseed oil, cordage, tallow and pitch, mixed with the salty air of the sea, the unwashed bodies of sailors, their animals and their refuse, and tobacco. I failed to mention earlier how popular it was to smoke. Aside from alcohol, this was the most popular drug, especially amongst pirates. They didn't have cigarettes, and if they robbed Spanish cigars, they would rip them apart and put the bucca into their pipes. These were long and made from white or red clay. Smoking was a popular pastime and made fire hazards a real threat. Tubs of water were in place for putting out embers, and if you smoked below deck, you had to do so with a cap on your pipe. Efforts were taken to improve the smell. The hatches were opened up for ventilation, the living quarters vigorously scrubbed with vinegar and sand. Pitch was burned for fumigation for the sake of odor and to prevent sickness. According to contemporary miasma theory, diseases were airborne and caused by smell. Other efforts were done to improve hygiene. Razors were documented in the possessions of pirates, and most comfortable was to keep a mustache or a clean shave. This was in accordance to contemporary fashion. Hair was either shaved, braided or clubbed, and lice were definitely an issue. If the pirates had an Indian aboard, he might pick their hairs and eat them, as some tribes associated with pirates, like the Kuna, were known to do. Since there wasn't enough fresh water to go around, pirates didn't bathe or wash their clothes aboard. The best way to get a change of clothes was to steal them, and clothing were some of the most common goods plundered by pirates. But these solutions were only temporary, as all the rubbish was swept into the bilge. This was the smelliest part of the ship, and going down there could lead to asphyxiation from the vapors, fit to poison the devil. Meanwhile, the multitude of rats and cockroaches seemed entirely immune. But I'll have to discuss that in an upcoming video about toilets aboard a pirate ship, because yeah, I do have enough material for a video like that. How could you tell? For these reasons, the horrible smell, lack of space and humid heat, sailors and pirates in the tropics prefer to sleep on the open deck. William Dampier wrote how, "In privateers especially, when we are at an anchor, the deck is spread with mats to lie on each night. Every man has one, some two, and this with a pillow for the head and a rug for a covering, is all the bedding that is necessary for men of that employ. Even captains, who had their own private cabin, often shunned their comfortable cradlings to go up and sleep on the quarterdeck. Pirates didn't necessarily sleep under the stars. That would be kinda bad if it started raining. Instead, a sail was rigged over the deck to provide cover. During daytime, it gave shade against the sun." I've discussed a lot of facets from pirate life in this video. Going into each activity more extensively would have taken up an hour or more, so I intend to do just that. But not here and now. In the future, you will find more videos about a pirate's daily life on the channel. For example, I've got lengthy notes written about their hygiene, dice and card games, and the pets and animals which they kept aboard. I already have a video about shipboard music and what food they ate. If you have any suggestions or questions, you can just tell me in the comments.
Huge thanks to my Patreon supporters, in particular Cole Freer, Max Dweck, Michaela Jantz, 1660, Daniel Stryker, and Sea-Dog. If you enjoyed the video, sharing it with a friend or on social media will help me immensely. And if you'd like to interact with me or fellow pirate enthusiasts, check out the link to our Discord server in the video description. Hope to see you there. Cheers!